The wind whispered through the fir trees, bending them just slightly as the last of the autumn sun dipped beneath the Oregon hills. Vivian Hale sat in the wicker chair on her porch, the same chair her husband Grant had once stained himself after they moved into the house 40 years ago. It creaked beneath her slight frame, the sound as familiar and worn as the lines etched into her palms. She watched the golden light slide over the horizon, holding her mug like an anchor. The silence around her was thick, a kind of peace that had grown sharp around the edges. She had always been a quiet woman, by choice, not by weakness. Reserved, some said? Stoic? But it wasn't until Grant died 12 years ago that she understood how little room the world had left for a woman like her. Still, she had her son, Caleb. Her reason, her constant. She had raised him with a fierce devotion she never knew she possessed. When Grant's sudden heart attack left them shattered, she stitched herself together for Caleb's sake. There were nights she cried alone in the laundry room so he wouldn't see. Mornings she put on her lipstick with trembling hands and smiled over burnt toast. Now Caleb was 31, grown, successful, steady like his father once was. A quiet tech consultant with a sharp mind and kind eyes. He'd recently moved back to Portland with his fiancée, Lindsay Carr. And just like that, the rhythm of Vivian's life began to shift again. Lindsay Carr, that name alone felt like a different species. Glossy, sleek, designer shoes clicking against hardwood floors. The kind of woman who arrived with the scent of rosewater and ambition trailing behind her. She was everything Vivian was not. Bold, impeccably styled, and connected. Her father was some retired senator with a ranch in Wyoming. Her mother, Joanna Carr, ran art galas and silent auctions like a general marshalling troops. The first time they met, Lindsay had reached for a hug and kissed the air beside Vivian's cheek. "Oh, it's so cute how your house has that, vintage feel," she had said, eyes scanning the floral wallpaper like it was a dead animal. Vivian had smiled, polite. She had been raised to bite her tongue, not raise her voice. There were rules, especially when you were a guest in your own son's future. Since then, it had been a steady stream of phone calls she wasn't included in, appointments she was told about after the fact, tastings and dress fittings that seemed to have no room for her. She didn't want to interfere. She told herself that often. Lindsay had a vision, and it wasn't her place to disrupt it. Still, it stung. The small slights, the missed invitations, the way Lindsay called her Vivian with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and Caleb, sweet, loyal Caleb, seemed to float between them, tethered to both but firmly anchored to neither. He'd shrug it off when she mentioned something. "Lindsay just gets a little stressed with planning. She doesn't mean anything by it." Maybe she didn't. Maybe it was all in her head. Maybe it was the way the world had changed around her, and she hadn't quite kept pace. Vivian had spent most of her life in that same house, in that same town, surrounded by the same faces. The Hales weren't flashy, but they were reliable, solid. She had been raised on casserole recipes and unspoken grief. Her mother never talked about her miscarriages. Her father had disappeared into silence after the war. You learned to endure. She tried to be happy for Caleb. He had found someone. That should have been enough. Yet sometimes when Vivian looked at Lindsay, something unspoken stirred in her, an itch just behind her ribs. A warning maybe, or regret. Inside, her house smelled like old wood and cinnamon. The walls bore photos of Caleb at every age. A crooked smile at 7, braces at 14, his college graduation. Each image a timestamp of all the years they had weathered together. Now she was being asked to smile quietly in the background of the next chapter. No title, no lines, just a silent witness. That night, as she washed the last of the dinner dishes, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, the phone buzzed on the counter. A group message. Lindsay had sent out final bridal party assignments. Vivian clicked the message open and read it twice. Her name wasn't there. No speech, no entrance, no recognition. The water stilled. Her hands remained beneath the surface, fingers pale and pruned. She could feel the weight of the omission settle on her chest like wet wool. A mother's place was not at the table, apparently, not at the ceremony, not in the story they were writing. Still, she said nothing. She finished the dishes, dried her hands, and folded the towel neatly over the sink. Then, she walked out onto the porch again. The light was gone now. Only shadows remained. She finished the dishes, dried her hands, and folded the towel neatly over the sink, Then she walked out onto the porch again. The light was gone now. Only shadows remained. Vivian Hale sat alone in the dark, listening to the wind and wondering, was this what it meant to age? To watch the world you built forget your name? To love something so fully, only to be edited out of its ending? She did not cry, she did not rage, but something began to shift inside her, quiet and slow, like the first tremor before the storm. The table was set with all the polish of Lindsay's world. White linen napkins folded into neat triangles, bone china plates rimmed with gold, and a candlelit centerpiece that gave the whole room a glow far too warm for how cold it felt. Vivian Hale sat at the end, her seat clearly not meant to command attention. She smoothed the front of her navy blouse, a simple cotton button-up she'd worn a dozen times before, and tried not to notice Lindsay's eyes flit across it like it offended her. The Carrs had invited her to dinner under the pretense of wedding updates, but so far, the conversation had remained surface level. Joanna Carr, all pearls and precision, held court on one end, sipping from a crystal wine glass like the glass was auditioning for a catalog. Lindsay floated between her and Caleb, her voice sugary and clipped. Vivian could feel it before it happened. That prickling tension behind her ears, like she was about to be dissected in front of strangers. "So, Vivian," Lindsay said, settling her eyes on her future mother-in-law, "I was thinking we could assign everyone their places for the ceremony next week, just to make sure things flow smoothly." Vivian gave a small nod. "Of course, just let me know where you'd like me to be." Lindsay smiled. "Perfect. So, Caleb and I talked about it, and we really want to keep the ceremony streamlined visually." "Visually," Vivian repeated slowly. "Yes, minimal distractions. Simple elegance, you know?" Lindsay placed her manicured hands over Caleb's. He flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. "Which is why we thought it might be better if the wedding party was limited to just the bridesmaids and groomsmen. No parent processional. It's sort of an outdated tradition anyway." Vivian blinked. "You mean I won't walk Caleb down the aisle?" There was a beat of silence, the kind that arrives with finality, not accident. "Well," Lindsay began, her smile brittle, "you've done so much already, raising him and all. We just thought, maybe it's time for you to relax, enjoy it as a guest. It might be easier that way." "Easier," Vivian echoed. Caleb shifted in his seat, looking at the tablecloth as if the pattern suddenly fascinated him. "She's his mother," came a soft voice from the other side. Elaine, Vivian's childhood friend, who had been invited as a courtesy, but held herself with the kind of quiet rebellion that didn't go unnoticed. "She's not a guest." Lindsay didn't even blink. "Of course, she's family, but it's our day. We want it to feel modern, youthful." Youthful. Vivian stared at her, the word hanging in the air like a slap that had been delivered with a smile. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks but forced it down. She was good at that. She'd been taught well. "Vivian?" Caleb asked finally, his voice hesitant. "Are you okay with that?" She looked at him. Really looked. Her son, who once clung to her leg on the first day of kindergarten, now an adult man unsure if his mother belonged in the most important day of his life. "I'm fine," she said, the lie so familiar it didn't even taste bitter. Dinner went on. The laughter resumed in patches, Joanna bragging about the event planner, Lindsay sharing honeymoon details. Vivian nodded, smiled when necessary, chewed food she couldn't taste. She barely noticed when dessert was served. That night, back in her car, she sat in the dark driveway of her quiet home, engine off, hands still on the wheel. She hadn't driven on the freeway at night in years. It felt disorienting, like she'd crossed through a membrane into a world that had passed her by. She went inside, took off her shoes, and stood in the hallway where Caleb's height had been penciled on the wall each year. The last mark was from when he turned 18. She touched it gently, then walked to the kitchen to make tea. Her hands shook slightly as she set the kettle down. Something inside her, something long dormant, had stirred during dinner. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter, older, like recognition. She sat at the table waiting for the water to boil. And that's when she saw the envelope. It had no return address, just her name, Vivian Hale, written in neat cursive across the front. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single photo, an old one, faded at the edges. Caleb, maybe 3 years old, stood in a sunlit backyard holding a balloon. But it wasn't the image that made Vivian's breath catch. It was the woman kneeling beside him, smiling, holding him by the shoulders. Vivian didn't recognize her. On the back of the photo in the same cursive were 4 words: "You don't know everything." Her tea kettle screamed behind her, forgotten. Vivian stared at the photo, her heart thudding against her ribs. She flipped it over again as if a second look would offer clarity. But the woman remained a mystery. Caleb looked so happy in that photo, so familiar, and yet questions tumbled into her mind, colliding like traffic with no signals. Who was the woman? Why had this been sent now? Why did it feel like a warning? She wanted to ignore it, chalk it up to someone's cruel idea of a joke. But she couldn't, because something had shifted tonight, something fundamental. She'd been quiet her whole life, respectful, graceful. She'd swallowed generations of silence, stood aside when it was asked of her. But now, with this photo in her hand and the echo of Lindsay's voice still fresh in her ears, Vivian Hale began to wonder. What if silence had never been safety? What if it had been the lie all along? And for the first time in decades, she felt the slow, deliberate burn of something rising inside her. Not fear, not sorrow. Resolve. The photograph sat on the kitchen table for 3 days. Vivian didn't touch it, but she couldn't stop looking. Every time she passed, her eyes drifted toward it. The smile on Caleb's face, the unknown woman's gentle grip on his shoulders. The back still read the same. You don't know everything. She didn't need to be reminded. That ache, that uncertainty, had been part of her life long before the photo arrived. It simply had a new face now. The past came rushing back like it always did, uninvited, sharp-edged. She was 24 again, standing outside the Hale family estate in Bend, Oregon. It had rained the night before her wedding, and she remembered how her dress had muddied at the hem when she stepped onto the stone path. No one had offered to help her. Grant's mother, Margaret, had simply clucked her tongue and said, "You should have thought of that before choosing satin." The house had been grand and cold, just like its matriarch. Margaret and Charles Hale made their expectations clear from the start. Vivian was to be dutiful, quiet, polished. No opinions unless asked, no conflict unless approved. Grant, handsome and well-bred, had nodded along. "They mean well," he'd always say. "It's just their way." But over time, Vivian learned that their way meant silence from her. It meant holiday dinners where her place was to listen, never lead. It meant biting her tongue when Charles critiqued the way she cooked or Margaret rearranged her living room under the pretense of elevating the space. When Caleb was born, things got worse. Margaret insisted on being in the delivery room. Vivian had said no. Grant had overruled her. "He's my son, too," he said with a frown, "and she's his grandmother. Stop being emotional." Vivian had cried in the hospital bathroom that night, pressing a towel against her mouth to muffle the sobs. No one came looking for her. After Grant died of a stroke at 48, the house grew quieter but not freer. Caleb was only 19 away at college, and Vivian found herself with more room to breathe and more silence than she knew what to do with. The phone stopped ringing. The cars offered condolences, but no one came to sit beside her. She cleaned Grant's closet alone, boxed up the ties, folded the golf shirts. She told herself she had chosen her life, but some days she couldn't tell if she had built a home or a prison. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, years after Grant's funeral, that Elaine Harper had knocked on her door. "Did you forget how to use a phone, or are you just playing dead now?" Elaine had barked, hands on her hips, a lopsided pie in the other. Vivian hadn't laughed much those days, but she had that afternoon. Elaine didn't knock to be invited in. She walked straight through like she belonged. Elaine was everything Vivian wasn't: loud, unfiltered, and allergic to decorum. Divorced 3 times and proud of it, she wore red lipstick like armor and had a knack for knowing when someone was lying, especially to themselves. I'm not saying your life was a total hostage situation, she said once, sipping black coffee in Vivian's kitchen. But I do think you got real comfortable playing quiet so you didn't have to ask why no one else listened. Vivian remembered flinching at that. Elaine never did handle things gently. Now, years later, Vivian called her again. The minute she picked up, Vivian said, "Can you come over?" 10 minutes later, Elaine breezed through the door with a cardigan half on and her sunglasses still in her hair. "You look like you found out you're adopted and your real mom is a crime boss," she said, eyeing Vivian. Vivian slid the photo across the table without a word. Elaine picked it up, squinted, then let out a low whistle. "That's not you," she said. "No." Elaine flipped it over. "You don't know everything." "Creepy." Vivian nodded. "I don't know who she is or who sent it." Elaine tapped the edge of the photo on the table. "Have you talked to Caleb?" I don't want to accuse him of something. What if it's nothing?" Elaine raised a brow. "That's the line you've always used. What if it's nothing? What if they didn't mean it? What if you're just being emotional? You ever notice how every time you feel something, you convince yourself it's a mistake?" Vivian looked away. The words stung because they were true. Elaine leaned in, her voice lowering. "Viv, I know it's not my business, but I've always wondered. You ever think something was off after Caleb was born? Like, off in a real way?" Vivian frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I was there, remember? After the hospital, you were out cold for days, drugged. You told me later you didn't remember holding Caleb right away." Vivian's stomach turned. "It was the grief. The birth was hard. They gave me something to help me sleep." Elaine shook her head. "They gave you silence and you took it." Vivian stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The wind moved through the trees outside, the same trees she'd watched Caleb climb as a child. "I don't know what you're suggesting," she said. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm saying maybe it's time you started asking the questions no one ever let you ask." Vivian stayed silent, but something inside her, a long, sealed door, began to rattle on its hinges. Later that night, alone again, Vivian lay in bed and let the weight of her past settle in like a second blanket. The sound of Margaret's voice still echoed in her head. "A good wife knows when to yield. A good mother doesn't ask for gratitude. A good woman stays gracious." Vivian had tried to be all those things, and in doing so, she had erased herself, one compromise at a time. Now, looking at the photograph on her nightstand, at the woman she didn't recognize holding the child she loved more than life itself, she whispered into the dark, "I want the truth." And this time, she didn't bite her tongue. It started with insomnia. Vivian Hale hadn't slept a full night since the dinner at the Cars. She'd lie awake, listening to the tick of the antique wall clock in the hallway, each second a soft, insistent nudge against her stillness. Sometimes she'd get up and sit in the kitchen with tea, the photograph resting beside her like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Other times, she would wander into the living room and run her fingers over the framed images of Caleb through the years, trying to find certainty in his smile. On the fourth sleepless night, she turned to her laptop, its cold light the only illumination in the room. It was past 3 a.m., and something in her wouldn't settle. She opened the wedding planning website Lindsay had once shown her and searched the venue they were supposed to use, an old estate property nestled on the coast. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe a picture, maybe a connection. Instead, she found a red banner across the top of the listing, temporarily unavailable for events, licensing under review. Vivian blinked, then clicked. The cancellation notice was dated only a week ago. Quiet, buried in the site. She checked the car's registry page. Nothing had changed, no update about the location, no mention of a switch. A thought, tentative and sharp, formed in her mind. They don't want anyone to know. She called Elaine the next morning. "Do you want to take a ride with me?" The drive out to the coast was long and winding. Vivian gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Her eyes focused on the road, but her mind flickering through memory. When they reached the estate, once a winery turned wedding venue, it stood empty. The front gate locked, but the sign still hanging. Weather-worn, grand, untouched. Elaine stepped out of the car and stared up at it. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked. Vivian didn't respond. She walked to the gate, stared through the bars. Beyond them was a courtyard overrun with fallen leaves and climbing ivy. But it was beautiful and familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Later that day, back at home, Vivian opened Grant's old file cabinet. She hadn't touched it in years. Inside were bank statements, investment logs, old contracts. Grant had managed his wealth conservatively, carefully. When he passed, he left most of it untouched, enough to live on and then some. Enough, perhaps, to do something that mattered. She stared at the statement for a long time. She could buy it. The thought sat heavy in her chest. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but because for the first time in her life, Vivian saw a space that could belong to her. Not borrowed, not permitted. Heron. But then came the doubt. Would this be petty? Would Caleb understand? Would it make her the villain in a story already painting her invisible? Elaine didn't hesitate. You're not buying it for them. You're reclaiming what's yours. Your narrative. Your name. Vivian didn't answer, but the next day she made the call. Within a week, the paperwork was signed. Quietly, privately. The venue was hers. The renovations were subtle. Vivian didn't want chandeliers or gold-trimmed mirrors. She wanted the wood beams restored to their original color. She had a local artist paint a mural on the back garden wall, an abstract depiction of a mother and child surrounded by wildflowers. She had the chapel chairs replaced with reclaimed pews from a decommissioned church in her hometown. And in the bridal room, she hung a mirror, antique, slightly chipped but warm, etched with the words, "You are not too old to be seen." Elaine helped her with everything, paint samples, lighting, even choosing the scent diffusers. But Elaine was also busy with something else, something she didn't tell Vivian about until she had a file in her hands. It was late afternoon. Vivian was adjusting flowers on a windowsill when Elaine walked in. "I found something," she said. Vivian turned. Elaine's expression was different this time. Not teasing, not smug, just heavy. She handed her the manila folder. Vivian opened it. Hospital records, her name, her birth date, the hospital in Bend. Date of delivery, March 4th, 1993. The pages were photocopies, scanned from microfiche. Some of the ink had faded, but the details were clear enough. Patient sedated post-delivery, unconscious for extended period. Anomalies noted in postnatal recovery log. Infant number 2, stillbirth declared 3:47 a.m. Infant number 1, transferred to NICU, chart reassigned. Vivian's heart stopped. "Infant number 2?" she whispered. Elaine nodded. They listed twins. One supposedly died, but I called a friend who used to work admin there. She said the file looked odd, incomplete, some parts missing. She thinks the adoption program the Carr family funded was tied to that hospital at the time. Vivian sat down. The file trembled in her hands. "I didn't even know I was having twins," she said. "Of course you didn't," Elaine said. "You were 19, barely more than a girl, and you trusted the people around you to tell you the truth." Vivian stared out the window. The wind moved through the trees again, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt like a warning. "So, you're saying—" Vivian couldn't finish the sentence. Elaine did it for her. "I'm saying it's possible, just possible, that someone took your child and told you they died." Vivian's eyes burned, not with tears. Not yet, just fire, deep and hollow. The venue she had purchased, the sanctuary she had quietly built for herself, suddenly felt like more than a symbol. It felt like a front-row seat to a life she had been denied. And somewhere, deep inside her, the silence that had defined her began to crack. It was no longer about walking Caleb down the aisle. It was about the lies that lined every hallway she had passed through, the truths she had been denied because no one believed she would ask the right questions. Well, now she was asking, and someone, somewhere, was going to answer. Lindsay Carr never learned to breathe in silence. Silence, in her world, was never a refuge. It was a signal, a test, a moment for someone to take control if you didn't seize it first. At 30, Lindsay had perfected the art of composure. Her voice never cracked, her clothes never wrinkled, and her hair moved like it obeyed invisible choreography. She was sharp, elegant, and always prepared, But under the curated perfection, she carried a private, ever-present fear. The fear of being dismissed, irrelevant, invisible. Like her mother said, if you're not the one leading the room, you're already beneath it. Lindsay had grown up in the kind of house where emotions were neatly folded and stored away, like seasonal linens. Joanna Carr, her mother, kept their lives cataloged. Photos arranged by event, social connections pruned like bonsai trees. There was never a hair out of place at the dinner table, and you didn't speak unless it was to elevate the family's image. Her father was present in name only, always traveling, often appearing for formalities like Christmas and fundraising galas. By 12, Lindsay had already absorbed the rules of survival: charm over truth, image over vulnerability, control over connection. She remembered standing in the hall, overhearing her mother say to a friend, "Lindsay's too soft. She'll be eaten alive if I don't steel her up." And from that moment forward, softness became her enemy. In high school, she curated her persona with surgical precision: class president, debate team captain, never without lip gloss and confidence. She dated boys who looked good beside her, won awards with cool detachment, and smiled through the ache when no one ever asked what she actually wanted. By the time she met Caleb Hale, she was tired. Tired of spinning, tired of fixing, tired of pretending that perfection felt good. Caleb was different, stable, quiet, kind. He didn't need fixing, and more importantly, he didn't try to fix her. His simplicity was a balm she didn't know she craved, but even that had to be shaped. He didn't dress well enough, she changed that. Didn't speak up at dinners, so she coached him. He hesitated when she critiqued his mother, so she made her distaste subtle enough that he couldn't object, just squirm. Because what Lindsay feared most wasn't failure. It was becoming someone like Vivian Hale. She saw it the moment they met. The cardigan, the hesitant voice, the way Vivian stood like she expected to be moved aside. It horrified her, not because Vivian had done anything wrong, but because she saw in her a version of herself that might emerge if she ever stopped performing. She saw the woman whose needs had been buried so long, she no longer remembered what they were. The woman who smiled when she was hurt and apologized for being present. Vivian wasn't competition. She was a warning, and Joanna Carr saw it too. "She's already overstepping," Joanna said one evening, swirling her wine in a glass so thin it seemed to tremble with her breath. "Showing up to fittings, trying to offer suggestions. It's desperate." They were seated in Joanna's private lounge, all white velvet and silver trim. Lindsay sipped her martini, legs crossed, jaw clenched. "I've got it under control," she said. Joanna raised a brow. "Do you?" Because letting her walk Caleb down the aisle sends a message that she's still relevant, that she matters. Lindsay stared at her mother. "She's his mother." Joanna leaned forward. "And you're his future. Don't confuse legacy with authority. You're marrying into a name, one that still has public weight. We don't need a sentimental sideshow." The words cut cleanly. Lindsay looked away. "You're not a girl anymore," Joanna added. "You're a Carr, and soon a Hale. That means something. Don't forget who we are." It wasn't a suggestion. It never was. After the conversation, Lindsay found herself walking through her apartment in circles, wine glass in hand. The walls were tastefully designed, the lighting perfect, but everything felt sterile. She looked at her own reflection in the mirror over the fireplace. Perfect posture, flawless makeup, but a hollowness in her eyes she couldn't quite blink away. She thought of Vivian, how she looked at Caleb during dinner, not saying much, but watching with a quiet intensity that Lindsay couldn't match. That kind of love unsettled her. It had no performance, no manipulation, just presence, and she hated that it made her feel small. The next morning, she sent a message to the planner. "Please remove Vivian Hale from the processional schedule. She'll be seated in the reserved guest section." That evening, she stood in her walk-in closet, laying out outfit options for a pre-wedding dinner. Cream silk blouse, black pencil skirt, red heels. Timeless, sharp. But her hands paused on a cardigan tucked into the corner, a soft, faded blue one she hadn't worn in years. The kind of thing Vivian might wear, the kind of thing Lindsay once loved before her mother declared, "You look like a secretary on a lunch break." She held it for a second longer than she meant to, then folded it back. Lindsay didn't know about the venue yet. She assumed it was still in limbo, that Joanna's assistant was working through legal negotiations to keep it quiet. But something in her had begun to itch, an intuition she hadn't yet named. Vivian wasn't resisting. She was quiet, but not passive. And that, more than anything, made Lindsay nervous. Because in her world, silence was always the most dangerous sound of all. The air around the Old Bend hospital carried a kind of memory, stale, sterile, laced with antiseptic and time. Vivian hadn't been back in over 30 years. The maternity wing had been renovated twice, but the lobby was the same. High ceilings, yellowed tile, a faint buzz from flickering fluorescent lights. She stood at the check-in desk with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the photo of Caleb and the mystery woman tucked into her purse like contraband. "I'm trying to access my maternity records from March 1993, she said softly to the clerk, a young man who barely looked up. "I had my son here. There were complications. I think there may have been more to the story." He blinked at her. "You'll need to submit a formal request. Anything before 2000 is sealed under legacy compliance laws." Vivian nodded. "And how long does that take?" He shrugged. "Could be weeks." Her breath caught. Weeks. She didn't have weeks. She wasn't even sure she had hours, not with the wedding date looming and the photo and that file Elaine had brought her, its details still echoing in her ears. She left the desk and sat on the nearest bench. For a long time, she just stared at the floor. This hospital had taken something from her, maybe not just Caleb's brother or sister, but the truth, the agency to grieve, to know. And for decades, she had simply accepted it. That was the real theft. She didn't know what made her look up, but she did, right as an older woman rounded the corner near the nurse's station. She walked with a slight limp, her hair pulled into a thin gray bun, her uniform replaced by a floral cardigan and slacks. Something about her face was familiar, like a dream, half remembered. Vivian stood. "Excuse me," she said, walking toward her. Did you work here in the early 90s? The woman hesitated. "I did. Retired 10 years ago. Who's asking?" "My name is Vivian Hale. I gave birth here in 93. There were complications. I was sedated for days, and I just found out I may have had twins. One was listed as a stillbirth, but I never held them. Never even saw them." The woman's eyes narrowed. "I remember you." Vivian's breath hitched. "You do?" The woman nodded slowly. "Dolores Baring. I was a night shift nurse in maternity. You were out for nearly 4 days. We weren't told why." Vivian steadied herself. "Do you remember if I had twins?" Dolores didn't answer right away. She glanced around, then gestured for Vivian to follow her. They sat in a quiet corner near a vending machine. Dolores looked tired, wary. "I remember something strange," she said, her voice low. "A man in a suit came in on the second night. He wasn't hospital staff. He carried a file marked Private Donor Protocol. Said he was here on behalf of the Carr Foundation." Vivian froze. "Carr?" Dolores nodded. "Said it was an arrangement between families, that the second infant would be transferred. Quietly. I didn't ask questions. Back then, you didn't. You just followed orders." Vivian felt her heart break, sharp and sudden like glass shattering behind her ribs. "They told me the baby died," she whispered. "I know," Dolores said, "and I've thought about you every year since." By the time Vivian made it home that evening, her hand shook as she opened the door. The walls felt different now, too bright, too honest. She laid the photo and Dolores's handwritten note on the table. Then, almost without thinking, she reached for the envelope she'd sent out last week, the one with Caleb's hair from his old baby brush and a sample from her own toothbrush. She opened her laptop, logging into the DNA kit portal. The results were ready. Probability of maternity, 0.04%. She stared at the screen, blinking, once, twice. The words didn't change. Caleb wasn't her biological son. She leaned back, breathless, the world tilting slightly under her. The child she had nursed, held, watched grow, the boy whose laugh had saved her during the worst years of her life, wasn't her son by blood. But then who was he? And where was her child? The next morning, Vivian didn't cry. She moved slowly, deliberately as she packed the photo, the letter, the DNA report into a folder. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, only that she couldn't unsee the truth now, and still she loved him. Caleb, every bit as much as the day she first held him. That had not changed, but someone, somewhere, had rewritten her story, had stolen her motherhood and sold her silence, and now she was done being quiet. Vivian stood at the edge of Caleb's backyard, watching him adjust string lights along the fence. The air smelled of fresh cut grass and early spring, a scent that once signaled beginnings but now felt unsteady, like a promise too fragile to trust. She gripped the folder in her bag, the DNA results, the photo, Dolores's note, but didn't pull it out. Not yet. Need help? She asked, her voice casual. Caleb looked over his shoulder, smiling softly. I think I've got it. Just trying to make it look festive. Lindsay's hosting the bridal party thing here tomorrow. Vivian nodded. She's good at that. Hosting. A beat passed. The silence between them was comfortable on the surface, but under it, tension flickered like static electricity. She wanted to tell him everything, to scream it, but she didn't know what he'd hear, the truth or betrayal. I was thinking about when you were little, she said instead, folding her arms. Do you remember much from those early years, before you started school? Caleb paused. Bits and pieces. I remember you reading to me in the kitchen, that old rocking chair, and how we used to drive out to the coast, but it's all kind of fuzzy. Why? Vivian's smile was tight. Just thinking about how fast it all went. Sometimes I wonder what I missed. Caleb laughed, but it was hollow. You didn't miss anything. You were always there. She wanted to believe that. She really did. That night, she couldn't sleep again. The questions were louder than the quiet, so she got up, made tea, and sat at the desk in the spare room. She pulled out a yellow notepad and began to write. Dear child of mine, I don't know your name. I don't know your face, but I know you lived, and I know you were taken. They told me you died. I believed them because I had no strength to fight. I was alone, exhausted, and silenced. I wish I had looked harder, screamed louder, but I didn't know how. I'm learning now. Her hand trembled as she wrote. The words came slowly at first, then in waves. Every time I looked at Caleb, I saw my survival. But somewhere, deep inside, I knew there was more to our story. I knew something was missing. That missing piece was you. She set the pen down and stared at the page, her eyes glassy. She'd always thought grief was a clean wound, sharp, direct. But this grief was foggy, slow-burning. It had no edges, no clarity. It was mourning the moments she never had, first steps she never saw, laughter she never heard. And still, her love had not diminished, for either child. She began writing every night, letters folded into a worn envelope she kept beside her bed. She didn't know if they'd ever reach the child she lost. Maybe the words weren't for them at all. Maybe they were for her, to reclaim the voice she'd surrendered so long ago. On Sunday, she dressed carefully for the bridal brunch. Not flashy, but deliberate. A deep green linen dress with a soft shawl she'd once worn on her anniversary with Grant. She pinned her hair back and wore no makeup, just a pair of pearl earrings, quiet and certain. As she stepped onto the car's patio, the conversations dimmed for half a second. Joanna gave a tight smile from the table. Lindsay barely glanced up. Vivian didn't mind. She carried herself like the ground beneath her belonged to her. Because it did. She had lived too long in the shadows of other people's expectations. She had carried the weight of silence through decades of quiet rooms, unspoken grief, and withheld truths. But no more. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't try to win over anyone, but when Caleb caught her eye from across the yard, something shifted in his expression. He stood, walked over, and kissed her on the cheek. Glad you came, he said softly. Vivian looked at him, really looked, at the man he had become, at the child she had raised, at the truth now lodged between them like a splinter neither could remove. I wouldn't miss it, she said. Later that night, back at home, she added one final line to her letter. I don't know what happens next, but I will not be invisible anymore. Not to them, not to myself. She folded it, placed it with the others, and turned off the light. Whatever came next, wedding, truth, fallout, she would meet it on her feet, dignified, grounded, present. By the time wedding week arrived, the coastal venue buzzed with last-minute adjustments, florists hurrying through garden arches, caterers reviewing menus, and stylists inspecting every linen fold. The air was thick with the tension of perfection trying desperately to hold its shape. Lindsay Carr stepped out of the black SUV and blinked against the sun. She was flanked by two bridesmaids and a planner who spoke too fast. But none of it registered. Her eyes were fixed ahead, on the estate she had chosen, the setting she had curated down to the stemware. Only now, something was wrong. The entrance was newly painted, not white, not beige, but a warm, earthy sandstone, accented with hand-carved signage. Instead of the modern brass plaque with her and Caleb's names, there was an old wooden sign hanging on the wrought iron gate. Hale House, in memory of the mothers who built without applause. Lindsay's brow furrowed. "What is this?" she asked sharply. The planner flipped her tablet. "There was a note in the system last week, a change of ownership." Lindsay blinked. "What do you mean?" "The estate was purchased privately. I assumed you were informed. The Hale family now owns it." Lindsay's blood turned to static. Inside, Vivian stood in the center of the main hall, where the light poured through cathedral windows and washed across the floor in pale gold. She wore a slate gray suit and low heels, her hair softly pinned, no jewelry. Behind her, the walls told a new story. Portraits had been hung, black and white photos of mothers with children, some smiling, others candid and worn with time. There were framed quotes carved into oak planks. "Silence is not grace. Grace is choosing to speak even when you're told not to." Motherhood is not a role, it's a history. Caleb noticed them immediately as he entered from the back. He stood in the hallway quiet, watching his mother move between the chairs, adjusting things no one else would ever notice. "Mom?" he asked. She turned, calm. "I bought it," she said simply. "You... what?" "I own the venue. The previous owners were looking to sell. They had some permit issues. I made an offer and closed last week." He stared at her. "Why?" Vivian met his gaze. "Because I wanted to be part of this day. Because I wanted our story, your story, to be remembered. And because I'm done waiting for permission." Before Caleb could answer, Lindsay stormed through the doors. "What is this?" she snapped. How are you owning this?" Vivian's voice remained even. "It was available. I had the means, and I thought it could use a woman's touch." Lindsay's eyes flashed. "You had no right." "I had every right," Vivian said, stepping forward. "More right than anyone who tried to erase me." "You're making this about you." Vivian tilted her head. "I lived in the shadows of your decisions for months. This isn't about me. It's about reminding people where they come from." Joanna Carr entered just in time to catch the last sentence. She wore her signature ivory suit, pearls glinting like armor. "This is unacceptable," she said coolly. "You ambushed our family's event." Vivian didn't flinch. "I extended every courtesy. I haven't altered the ceremony schedule, haven't changed the guest list, but I won't be made invisible." Joanna stepped closer. "You're on dangerous ground, legal ground." Vivian smiled, slow and measured. "And you've been on stolen ground for decades. Shall we talk about that?" Caleb looked between them. "What is going on?" Before Joanna could respond, Elaine entered from the far corridor, a folder in hand. "Vivian," she said, "we need to talk, now." In a side room, Elaine opened the file and laid it on the table. "They tried to bury this," she said, "but I traced the adoption records through the Carr Foundation's private program. One child, female, born on March 4, 1993, transferred via private attorney to the Carr family under a closed adoption." Vivian's hands trembled. "Her name was changed within the month. No original birth mother listed, but the transfer date, it matches your hospital records." Vivian stared at the file, at the forged signatures, the blurred seal, the handwritten notation. Identity change complete. Pending finalization, Lindsay Marie Carr. Her knees nearly buckled. Elaine put a hand on her shoulder. "She's your daughter," Elaine whispered. Vivian felt her lungs contract. The woman who had dismissed her, ridiculed her, stolen her voice, that woman had once lived inside her, had once been placed in her arms and stolen before she could even speak her name. "Does she know?" Vivian asked. Elaine shook her head. "I don't think so." Vivian stood slowly. "She will." Back in the hall, guests began to arrive for the rehearsal. The tension in the room was palpable. Joanna whispered furiously with a man in a tailored suit. Lindsay stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes darting everywhere except toward Vivian. Caleb approached his mother again. "Why now?" he asked. Vivian looked at him, his face so familiar, so unknowable now. "I thought I raised you," she said gently, "but I may not be your mother." Caleb's face blanched. "What?" "I got the DNA results. I didn't want to believe it, but someone switched you, or me, or both, and I'm trying to find the truth." His voice cracked. "So I'm not—" "You are my son," she said fiercely. "Even if not by blood. I raised you. I loved you. That doesn't change, but someone took my child, and I think they gave me someone else's." Caleb's breath came in short bursts. He turned away, stunned. Vivian looked at him with sorrow and resolve. "This isn't over," she said, "but I will not let the people who built this lie continue to speak for me. Not anymore." Outside, the sun dipped behind the trees. Inside, a mother stood her ground. Vivian found Joanna alone in the conservatory, pruning a pot of white orchids with practiced precision. Sunlight poured through the glass, casting harsh beams on the tile floor, illuminating dust motes and half-truths. The door shut behind Vivian with a soft click, but the tension between them was immediate, thick, silent, and sharp-edged. Joanna didn't look up. "If this is another speech about the venue, save it. The rehearsal dinner is tonight. We have enough chaos without your dramatics." "I'm not here about the venue," Vivian said. Joanna's shears paused midair. "I'm here about Lindsay." That made Joanna look up. Her eyes, cold and unblinking, narrowed just slightly. "What about her?" Vivian stepped closer, placing a folder gently on the glass table between them. "I know." Joanna didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Elaine found the adoption records, the hospital, the car foundation transfer, the name change. Joanna slowly set the shears down. "And you're here to, what? Blackmail me? Threaten a lawsuit? You've already made quite the scene." "I'm here to give you one chance," Vivian said, voice low but firm. "One chance to tell the truth, before I take this to every paper in Oregon." Joanna's mouth twitched. Not fear, disdain. "I don't respond to threats," she said. "You will respond to this," Vivian snapped, her tone sharp for the first time in years. "You took my daughter. You let me believe she died. You let her believe I threw her away." Joanna stood slowly, stepping around the table with unnerving calm. "I didn't take your daughter," she said. "Your husband's family did, Margaret and Charles. They wanted to protect the Hale name. A teenage mother giving birth to twins out of trauma and grief? One child was manageable. Two was an embarrassment." Vivian blinked, her mouth open. "They what?" Joanna folded her arms. "Grant's parents approached my father. They had ties to the hospital. Your sedative dosage was no accident. You were kept under long enough for the handoff to happen without protest. My family handled the logistics. A closed adoption, clean paperwork, no trace." Vivian stumbled back, breath catching. Her chest burned, her throat raw with disbelief. "You raised her," she said. "You raised my child." Joanna's voice turned steel. "I protected her. She was given a life you couldn't offer." Vivian's hands shook. "She was mine." "And she was rejected," Joanna snapped. "She was told her birth mother left, that she wasn't wanted. Do you understand how hard I had to work to give her a life that wasn't built on that shame?" Vivian's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "Not here. Not now." "She grew up hating me," she whispered, "looking down on me, and you let her." Joanna didn't flinch. She needed someone strong, not a woman who wrote herself out of her own story. The slap, if it had come, would have hurt less. Vivian stepped closer. You may have rewritten my history, but you will not control my future. I will not let you keep lying to her. Joanna raised her chin. You'll ruin her. No, Vivian said. You already did that. I'm just trying to set her free. They stood there for a long moment. Two matriarchs in a war neither had started, both bleeding in places their children couldn't see. Then Joanna said, She won't believe you. Vivian opened the door. That's not your choice anymore. Outside, the sun was retreating, casting long shadows over the garden path. Vivian walked back to the house on trembling legs, her heart shattering and strengthening all at once. She had been lied to, robbed, erased, but not anymore. Lindsay was her daughter, and even if she didn't believe it, yet Vivian would stand in the truth long enough for her to see. The sky was an unforgiving blue, clear, bright, and without mercy. Guests arrived in muted clusters, dressed in summer pastels and wedding silks, smiles polite but tight, as though everyone could feel the weight in the air. A few whispered about the venue's recent makeover, others commented on the elegant mural in the back garden, but all of them noticed the tension hanging just beneath the pleasantries. Inside, Lindsay stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, clutching a champagne flute she hadn't touched. Her reflection stared back, calm in posture, chaotic in the eyes. Her veil lay folded beside her, untouched. Behind her, Joanna fussed with the gown's train, smoothing invisible wrinkles. Focus on the moment, she said. Today is the product of years of planning. Nothing matters but the walk down that aisle. Lindsay turned sharply. Nothing. Really? Because I just got blindsided with a story about being stolen from my real mother, and I'm supposed to smile and pretend we're still doing floral arrangements? Joanna straightened, face carefully neutral. That's hearsay. Vivian is spinning drama to control the day. That woman has always been emotionally unstable. Lindsay stared at her, something beginning to curdle behind her rib cage. You lied to me, she said. You said my birth mother abandoned me. Joanna's mask didn't slip. You were adopted into a better life. That's what matters. But you told me she didn't want me. Joanna said nothing. Silence stretched. Lindsay took a step back, shaking her head. You built my entire life on a lie. She would have ruined you, Joanna hissed. You were a newborn, alone, exposed to God knows what chaos. We saved you. No, Lindsay said, her voice rising. You stole me, and then taught me to hate her. Unbeknownst to either of them, Caleb had just walked past the suite and heard every word. He stood frozen, breath catching like it was snagged on glass. Joanna turned and saw him. Caleb, she began. He didn't speak, just stared at Lindsay, who looked back at him with a pale, broken expression. I just found out she's my mother, Lindsay said, the woman you've watched me mock and exclude for months. Caleb stepped inside slowly. Is it true? Joanna tried to intervene, but Lindsay nodded. Yes. The silence thickened again, this time with grief. 20 minutes later, the guests were seated. The ceremony music had begun, but Lindsay was nowhere near the aisle. Instead, she stood in the entrance of the main hall, flanked by Joanna and Caleb. Vivian stood at the opposite end, speaking with Elaine and the officiant. Then, everything snapped. You think you're some kind of hero? Lindsay shouted across the room. You think buying this venue and pasting your sad little quotes on the walls makes you a mother? The room froze. Lindsay, Caleb said quietly. Vivian turned to face her. Her face was calm, but her eyes shimmered. I never wanted to take anything from you, Vivian said, only the truth. You wormed your way into this wedding, Lindsay barked. Into my life, you're not a mother. You're a guest in a story you don't belong to. Vivian stepped forward, slow, steady. I never asked to belong to your story, Lindsay. I've only ever wanted to reclaim mine. You faked everything, Lindsay hissed. The grief, the letters, the ownership. You manipulated me. Vivian reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Then explain this, she said, her voice trembling. This is from the private investigator I hired. Hospital records confirmed under court authorization. I was drugged intentionally, so I wouldn't know both my babies had been born alive. They planned the separation, your adoption, everything. My in-laws, your family. They built a system to take children and erase women like me. The paper dropped between them like a verdict. Lindsay's knees buckled. She reached for a chair, eyes wide, breath shallow. Joanna rushed forward, but Caleb held up a hand. Stop. His voice for the first time was thunder. Everyone in the room turned. Caleb looked at his mother, at Lindsay, at Joanna. I don't know who I am anymore, he said. I don't know if I'm her son by blood or if I'm someone else's mistake. Vivian stepped forward. You are not a mistake. He turned to her, eyes glassy. You raised me. You taught me how to tie my shoes, read a map, survive after Dad. I'll never forget that. But right now, I need to understand where I come from, who I am, who she is. Lindsay looked up, voice cracking. So what does that mean? Caleb's voice was calm. It means I can't marry you today. Maybe not ever. Gasps echoed across the hall. Lindsay stared at him, stunned. Then slowly, quietly, she nodded. I don't blame you, she whispered. Then she turned and walked out. Joanna followed, but her steps were heavier now, her composure fractured. Caleb walked toward Vivian. She braced herself. I need time, he said softly. Vivian nodded, swallowing her emotion. Take all the time you need. He leaned in, kissed her on the forehead, then walked out the same way Lindsay had. Vivian stood in the middle of the room, the remnants of a wedding unraveling around her. But this time, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen, at last. The house was quiet again. Not the kind of silence that once made Vivian Hale feel erased, but something new, still, whole, as though the space was finally beginning to exhale after decades of being held too tightly. She sat on the porch swing with a blanket across her knees, her gaze fixed on the horizon where trees stood like sentinels in the afternoon light. Her tea had gone cold, but she hadn't noticed. She didn't need heat to feel warm. The screen door creaked open behind her, and Caleb stepped out holding 2 mugs. He placed one on the side table and took a seat beside her, their shoulders just barely touching. I still don't know where I came from, he said, his voice low, but I know who I came to be, and that was because of you. Vivian turned to him slowly. I may not have been your biological mother, she said, but I was your first word, your first bruise, your first winter coat. That counts for something. It counts for everything, he said. They didn't speak for a long time after that. They didn't need to. Lindsay left town 3 days after the canceled wedding. No press release, no confrontation. Just a note slipped beneath Vivian's door. I don't know who I am right now, but I know who I don't want to be. You didn't deserve what they did to you. And maybe I didn't deserve what they gave to me. I'm going to find out what I'm made of, without them. Maybe one day we can talk. Vivian kept the note folded in her journal. She didn't know what the future held for Lindsay, but there was hope in her words, a spark of redemption. She'd been raised to control everything. Maybe losing control was her first step toward healing. Vivian stood in a law office the next week, hands folded neatly in her lap as she met with Samantha Griggs, a sharp but kind-eyed attorney with a reputation for handling high-profile exploitation cases. I've reviewed the hospital records, the private investigator's report, and the forged adoption files, Samantha said. What happened to you was not just unethical, it was criminal. The Carr Foundation, your in-laws. There's a clear paper trail of coercion and fraudulent documentation. If you're willing, we can open this case. Vivian nodded, calm. I'm ready. Samantha leaned in. It's going to be a long road, but what you're doing, it could change everything. Not just for you, for others like you. I'm not afraid of the noise anymore, Vivian said. Elaine showed up that evening with a casserole dish and a folder marked Ideas. I've been thinking, she said, setting both down on the kitchen counter. We can't be the only ones. Women who've had their voices stolen, their families fractured, their truth buried under somebody else's version of what's best. Vivian raised a brow. You're starting a crusade? Elaine grinned. I'm starting a network. You're starting a movement. She flipped open the folder, mock-ups of a nonprofit website, ideas for retreats, a list of potential therapists and advocates. I want a place where women like you can find each other, Elaine said, where daughters don't have to grow up hating their mothers because someone edited the story. Vivian smiled, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. You never stop surprising me. Elaine winked. That's how I stay young. That night, Vivian walked through her house slowly, trailing her fingers along old furniture, touching framed photos with a new kind of reverence. These weren't relics anymore, they were anchors. She reached the mirror in the hallway, the one Lindsay had passed by 100 times without ever really seeing herself. She stood in front of it now, older, weathered, but upright. Her reflection wasn't perfect, but it was whole. There was so much she didn't know, about Caleb's origins, about the daughter she had lost, about the paths ahead. But she knew one thing: she was here. And for the first time in decades, that was enough. 6 months later, the ocean air carried a different weight. Less burden, more breath. The once abandoned wedding estate now bore a new sign at its entrance. The Hale House for Healing, a retreat for mothers and daughters finding their way back. The stonework had been restored, the paint refreshed in soft, welcoming hues. Where champagne towers once stood, there were now quiet reading spaces with oversized armchairs. Where bridal portraits were meant to hang, Vivian had installed a mural, a sweeping, abstract depiction of two female figures, hands barely touching but moving toward each other. It spanned the entire back wall of the main hall. Beneath it, a brass plaque was mounted. For the years stolen, for the voices silenced, for the women who still rise. Vivian stood in the main hall early that morning, barefoot, sweeping sunlight with her footsteps. The venue was no longer filled with the rustle of satin or the clink of champagne glasses. Instead, it pulsed with something quieter. Journals opened on benches, gentle conversations in corners, tears that fell without apology. Displaced mothers and daughters came here now, some newly reunited, some still learning each other's names, all tangled in some form of grief or rediscovery. Vivian didn't lead therapy sessions, but she did sit with them. She offered tea and warmth and stillness. That had become her ministry. She moved through the building each day like a curator of restoration, placing fresh flowers in vases, smoothing table linens, lighting candles in the chapel room, where prayers were less about religion and more about release. Caleb visited every week. At first, he came with stiff shoulders and awkward silences, unsure of how to navigate the man he'd always been and the identity he might have never had. But Vivian gave him space. She didn't push. She didn't ask for clarity he couldn't give. Instead, they sat together in the garden, watching the tide roll in, sharing memories that didn't need verification, only presence. He helped with the accounting now, and occasionally ran a workshop on digital tools for the retreat's younger guests. Every once in a while, he would pause mid-sentence and look at her, not with pity, not with confusion, but with awe. "You're not the same woman who raised me," he said one afternoon. Vivian smiled. "I'm finally becoming her." Lindsay hadn't returned, not yet. Vivian didn't expect her to. Healing came in phases, and some wounds required a longer road, but every so often a postcard would arrive. No return address, no signature, just a single sentence. "I remembered you used to wear green. I saw a mother hugging her daughter today and I didn't flinch. Still searching." Vivian kept each one in a box by her bed. Elaine, of course, had made herself director of programming. She strutted through the venue in red scarves and loud opinions, organizing workshops and trauma talks, and what she called rage brunches, where women could throw plates, cheap ones donated, to purge years of unspoken fury. "I told you," she said one day, pouring wine like it was sacrament. "You start something big enough, it stops being about you and starts becoming about them. That's when you know it matters." Vivian clinked her glass gently against hers. "To the ones who stayed quiet too long." "To the ones who don't anymore," Elaine replied. Vivian walked the property alone at sunset most evenings, stopping at the base of the memorial plaque. She didn't cry often anymore, not because the pain had dulled, but because the strength had caught up. There had been too much loss, too many names never spoken, too many years lived under someone else's story. But here, in the quiet golden hour of her own making, she no longer counted what had been taken. She counted what she had reclaimed: her truth, her voice, her family. She placed her hand on the plaque, her eyes closed, and for the first time in her life, Vivian Hale didn't whisper into silence. She stood, fully seen, fully home. What if the stories we silence are the ones that could set us free? If you've ever felt erased, overlooked, or rewritten, this story was yours before it was hers. Stay with us as we uncover the truths hidden behind polite smiles and family portraits. Because some legacies aren't inherited, they're taken back. One bold voice at a time. The next chapter is already being written. Are you ready to face it?